The numbers didn't change overnight. They've been building for 15 months. But on April 22, 2026, something shifted. Standing outside a Liberal caucus meeting on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked one question by reporters. Would Canada make concessions just to get a seat at the negotiating table? The answer was 2 letters. No. Not a hesitation, not a qualification, just a clean, flat refusal, delivered by a man who spent 2 decades managing the financial systems of 2 countries and who understands leverage the way most politicians understand polling numbers. And Washington lost its composure. Because what Carney did in that moment was not merely refuse a demand, he exposed the demand itself. He named the architecture of a strategy built on humiliation, dressed up as diplomacy. The Trump administration had been asking Canada to pay an entry fee, actual concessions on alcohol shelf placement, digital services taxes, regulatory frameworks, just to begin talking about a trade agreement that both countries already signed and that Washington has been systematically dismantling for 15 months. Carney looked at that and called it what it is, not a negotiation, compliance theater. Here is the sentence that changes everything. When a country imposes a 50% tariff on steel, a 50% tariff on aluminum, 25% tariffs on automobiles, and sweeping duties on softwood lumber, all on a trading partner protected by a signed free trade agreement, those are not irritants, they are violations. That one word, violations, is not semantic. It is strategic. It changes the legal architecture of the entire dispute. And that is why the response from Washington was not a counter-argument. It was a threat. Canada lives because of the United States, Trump said. Remember that, Mark. If you heat your home with natural gas, if you work in a plant that makes car parts, if you run a small business that imports supplies from across the border, this is not a story about politicians exchanging talking points. This is about the future of $2.5 billion worth of daily cross-border trade, and whether the agreement governing it survives the summer. This is about whether the framework that has underpinned North American prosperity since 1989 collapses in a conference room in the middle of 2026. And you are already paying for the turbulence, whether you know it or not. Meet Ryan. He runs a metal fabrication shop in Hamilton, Ontario, 23 employees, contracts with 2 automotive suppliers, and a cost structure that was stress-tested for normal. Since February 2025, the inputs he sources from U.S. suppliers have been caught in a tariff ping-pong that has added between 8 and 14% to his operating costs. He didn't pass all of that on. He couldn't. He absorbed some of it. He deferred a capital purchase. He stopped hiring. Ryan is not a headline. He is the unit of measurement that everyone in Ottawa and Washington keeps citing in their press releases and then forgetting the moment the cameras turn off. We know what we know about this situation because of the documented record, not the spin. 4 sources cited by Radio-Canada confirmed that the Trump administration sent Canada a specific list of pre-negotiation demands, an entry fee, before formal CUSMA talks could begin. This is not speculation. This is the operating condition. The U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer confirmed to Congress that the administration wants to preserve some aspects of CUSMA. Some. The word some is doing enormous work in that sentence, and we are going to unpack exactly what it means. The Bank of Canada's October 2025 Monetary Policy Report confirmed that the effective average tariff rate on Canadian goods entering the U.S. has risen from near zero at the start of 2025 to 5.9%, even with the CUSMA exemption still in place. Oxford Economics has it slightly higher, at 6.3%. Without the CUSMA exemption, Tony Stillo, Director of Canada Economics at Oxford Economics, said the country's economy would face, in his exact words, longer-term scarring. The size of the Canadian economy, he said, would be lower for several years, probably permanently. We have seen the timeline. It is not ambiguous. On February 4th, 2025, the first IEEPA tariffs on Canadian goods took effect. On March 4th, 25% tariffs hit most Canadian imports. On June 4th, steel and aluminum tariffs were doubled from 25% to 50%. On August 1st, blanket tariffs on Canadian goods were raised again to 35% on non-CUSMA compliant goods. Then, on February 20, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the IEEPA tariff authority as an overreach. Trump immediately pivoted to a 10% global tariff under different legal authority. The sectoral tariffs, steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, remained intact under Section 232, exempt from the court ruling. Canada had removed most of its retaliatory tariffs by September 2025 in good faith. The United States offered no parallel reduction. That is not negotiation. That is extraction. Picture the room in Ottawa on April 22nd. The building is serious, the kind of stone and glass that reads authority. Carney walks out of a Liberal caucus session. He is surrounded by reporters. He is fresh off securing a majority government. He has a mandate in his pocket and a July deadline bearing down on him. The reporters ask the entry fee question. Will Canada make concessions just to start talking? His body language is the tell. There is no pause to calculate optics. There is no careful triangulation. He answers from a place of settled conviction. We understand what the Americans would call trade irritants, or trade issues, he says. We are well prepared around those issues. Then the pivot. We will sit down and work through those issues. But this is not a case where the United States dictates the terms. In Washington, that response landed like a personnel issue. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick had already tried to bracket the entire dispute as political noise. In an interview with Bloomberg, Lutnick suggested that if Canada continues deepening ties with China, Carney had just brokered a deal reducing tariffs on Canadian canola and seafood in exchange for allowing Chinese EVs into the Canadian market. Then, when CUSMA gets renegotiated this year, in the middle of summer, do you think the President of the United States is going to say, you should keep having the second best deal in the world? That sentence is extraordinary, not because of its tone, because of what it reveals. The U.S. Commerce Secretary is openly threading a nuclear option into what is supposed to be a routine trade review. He is using the survival of CUSMA itself as leverage against Canadian foreign policy choices. That is not the behavior of a partner. That is the behavior of a patron. What Carney was actually thinking in that moment, and this is the part no press conference reaches, is that he has seen this movie before, not metaphorically, literally. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis. He served as governor of the Bank of England through Brexit. He has sat across tables from people using financial leverage as a weapon, and he has learned one lesson that transcends every specific negotiation. The moment you make a concession under pressure, you have not bought relief. You have bought a new demand. Early concessions do not stabilize negotiations. They calibrate the appetite of the party making the demands. Carney knows this in his bones, and that is why he didn't blink. The gut punch of this scene is simple. Canada already made the concessions. In September 2025, Canada removed most of its retaliatory tariffs, unilaterally, as a gesture of good faith ahead of trade talks. Canada canceled the digital services tax it had been collecting. Canada withdrew counter tariffs that, by Ottawa's own admission, were hurting Canadian consumers as much as U.S. exporters. Canada gave, Washington took, and then Washington asked for more, just to start talking. That is the moment Carney decided the pattern ends here. Now the receipts. Receipt 1. The tariffs are not mutual. Between February 2025 and April 2026, the Trump administration imposed at minimum 5 distinct rounds of tariff escalation on Canadian goods, using 3 separate legal authorities: IEEPA, Section 232, and the new global Section 122 tariff. Canada's counter tariffs were imposed, partially withdrawn, and then largely eliminated by September 2025. As of today, U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum stand at 50%. Canada's reciprocal tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum remain in place, covering approximately $15.6 billion worth of U.S. imports. The U.S. side is hitting Canada with approximately 3 times the tariff volume Canada maintains on U.S. goods. The framing that this is a symmetrical trade dispute, that both sides are equally entrenched, is false. The record shows a systematic escalation from one side and a pattern of measured de-escalation from the other. Verdict: Canada is not the aggressor in this dispute. The document trail proves it. But that's only the beginning of what the receipts reveal. Receipt 2. The CUSMA exemption is the only thing standing between Canada's economy and a structural recession, and it may not survive the summer. Oxford Economics confirmed that 90% of Canadian goods entering the United States as of July 2025 qualified for tariff-free access under the CUSMA exemption. That exemption is what kept the Bank of Canada's estimate of the effective tariff rate at 5.9% instead of something catastrophically higher. The July 2026 CUSMA review deadline, which both sides have already conceded is unlikely to produce a completed deal on time, is the event horizon. If CUSMA collapses, or if the exemption is stripped out, Tony Stillo said bluntly that Canada's economy would be lower for several years, probably permanently. Patrick LeBlanc of the University of Ottawa called the removal of the exemption a nuclear option. That nuclear option is now sitting on the table. Howard Lutnick put it there by name. Think about Ryan in Hamilton again. His shop is currently operating inside the CUSMA exemption bubble. His U.S. source supplies come in tariff-free. His automotive clients are protected. If that exemption disappears in July, every single one of his input costs reprices overnight. He doesn't get a grace period. He doesn't get a government rescue package fast enough to matter. He gets a bill. And he is not alone. There are tens of thousands of Ryans across Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, all of them operating on the assumption that the exemption holds. The July deadline is not an abstract policy date. It is the difference between Ryan making payroll in August and Ryan having to make cuts. Here's where it gets structurally darker. Receipt 3. The U.S. Supreme Court already struck down the primary tariff authority, and it changed almost nothing. On February 20th, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled that the IEEPA tariffs, the mechanism used to impose the original 25 to 35% blanket tariffs on Canadian goods, exceeded presidential authority. It was a significant legal rebuke. Trump's response took less than 24 hours. He announced a new 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. CUSMA-compliant goods remained exempt, but the sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, lumber, and autos imposed under Section 232 were not affected by the Supreme Court ruling at all. So the court struck down one tariff mechanism, and the administration immediately activated a backup. The receipts on Canadian businesses that paid the now illegal IEEPA tariffs between February 2025 and February 2026 are only now being processed for possible refunds. The structural message is unambiguous. Legal constraints are not a ceiling. They are a speed bump. Receipt 4. The July 2026 CUSMA review is not a negotiation about trade. It is a negotiation about whether Canada retains sovereign control over its own domestic policy. The U.S. entry fee demand, confirmed by 4 Radio Canada sources, includes items like alcohol shelf placement in Canadian provincial liquor stores, a matter of provincial jurisdiction in Canada. It includes regulatory frameworks affecting digital services. It includes agricultural supply management that Canada has protected through every trade negotiation since the original NAFTA. These are not trade irritants. These are attempts to reach inside Canada's constitutional structure and adjust it through economic pressure. Carney's finance minister, François-Philippe Champagne, said it plainly. We will continue to see what we can do, but I think Canadians have understood by now that diversification is key. What he did not say, but what every analyst in Ottawa understands, is this. Diversification is not just a strategy. It is a defensive posture against a partner that is no longer behaving like a partner. You are watching something real happen right now, not a press cycle, not a political performance, a structural reset in the most important bilateral trade relationship in the world. And most of the coverage you have seen has treated it like a drama between two personalities, Trump's bluster versus Carney's composure. That is the wrong frame entirely. Here is what every other outlet is missing. The real story is not what Carney said on April 22nd. The real story is what the Trump administration revealed by asking for an entry fee in the first place. Think about what that demand implies. It implies that Washington knows it cannot win this argument on the merits of the tariffs themselves. The IEEPA tariffs got struck down by the Supreme Court. The Section 232 tariffs are costing American manufacturers. The U.S. auto industry has been loudly documenting the supply chain disruption for 18 months. The American business community, as one Canadian negotiator noted on Background, is in full support of maintaining CUSMA. U.S. companies that rely on integrated North American supply chains are not rooting for tariff escalation. They are lobbying against it. So what does the Trump administration do when it cannot justify the tariffs legally and cannot defend them economically? It asks for concessions before the conversation even starts. It moves the goalpost to before the field. Let me translate that for you in plain language. When a party in a negotiation demands payment just to show up, it means they have concluded that the argument itself is unwinnable. The entry fee is not a negotiating position. It is an exit ramp from a debate they are losing. And Canada just refused to pay the toll. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Canada can hold this position all the way through the July CUSMA deadline? Or does the economic pressure eventually force concessions? I want to know what you think happens next. Now here is what nobody has explained about the psychology operating underneath this dispute. There are 3 moves happening simultaneously, and understanding all 3 is what separates the people watching this clearly from the people watching it as theater. The first move is the asymmetry illusion. The Trump administration has constructed and maintained a narrative that Canada is dependent and the United States is dominant. Trump's "Canada lives because of the United States" is the clearest expression of this worldview. It is also demonstrably incomplete. The United States took 71.7% of Canadian goods exports in 2025. The lowest share since the early 1980s, but still an enormous number. What that framing deliberately obscures is the counterdependency. The United States depends on Canadian energy, oil, natural gas, electricity, at a scale that cannot be replaced without significant domestic investment and a decade of lead time. It depends on Canadian critical minerals that are increasingly strategic in a world decoupling from Chinese supply chains. It depends on the integrated automotive supply chain, where components cross the border an average of 7 times before a finished vehicle reaches a dealership. Disrupting that is not punishing Canada. It is performing surgery on yourself. In plain language, the leverage is not one-directional. It never was. The second move is the procedural trap. The U.S. position has been to insist that CUSMA renewal and the sectoral tariffs, steel, aluminum, autos, lumber, are 2 separate and distinct issues. Canada's position, stated explicitly by Trade Minister Dominique LeBlanc, is that they are not separate. Canada will not sign a renewed CUSMA while industries under active tariff assault remain unresolved in a separate lane. This procedural disagreement is not a minor technical dispute. It is the entire battlefield. If Washington succeeds in separating the 2 tracks, it can bank a CUSMA renewal as a diplomatic win while keeping the sectoral tariffs fully intact, indefinitely. Canada would have signed a trade agreement that does not actually govern the tariffs hurting it most. LeBlanc's statement was precise. Canada does not want a one-off deal on CUSMA, while tariffed industries are left for another negotiation. The Americans are trying to split the file. Carney is refusing to let it be split. What that actually tells you is that the shape of any final deal will be determined entirely by who controls the agenda. And right now, neither side has conceded that question. The third move is the election math. Carney entered these negotiations with something unusual, a fresh parliamentary majority. He won the 2025 Canadian federal election, in part on the explicit promise to hold firm against U.S. economic coercion. His domestic political incentive structure and his negotiating posture are perfectly aligned. He does not face the normal tension between what is strategically correct and what is politically survivable. The Trump administration, by contrast, is moving through 2026 in a deteriorating political environment. Trump's approval rating sits at 36%, with 57% disapproval, according to recent polling. The administration has been rocked by the firing of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem and Attorney General Pam Bondi. A Democratic wave in the midterms could curtail the administration's ability to maintain its tariff posture entirely. Notice what the Trump administration has not done. It has not scheduled a formal bilateral summit with Carney since the tariff escalations began. It has not offered a credible de-escalation proposal on the sectoral tariffs. It has not acknowledged publicly that its own business community is lobbying against the tariff regime. Those absences are evidence. They tell you that the administration is managing a narrative, not pursuing a resolution. The Carney doctrine, name it as a doctrine because it now functions as one, holds that the only negotiation worth having is a negotiation that operates on equal footing. And equal footing begins with refusing to pay the cover charge. Now the expert voices who are backing this read. Patrick LeBlond, trade policy researcher at the University of Ottawa, has publicly characterized the U.S. posture in the clearest terms available. Washington is effectively saying, we're going to put the gun to your head and you're going to give us what we want. His analysis. The asymmetry is real, but the fatalism attached to it is not. He expects some form of permanent sectoral tariffs to be possible, if not likely, at the end of the 2026 CUSMA review. But he frames the nuclear option, eliminating the CUSMA exemption, as something the Trump administration would pay a serious domestic price for deploying. Lutnick's threat put the gun on the table. That does not mean the trigger gets pulled. Tony Stillo at Oxford Economics has modeled both scenarios with precision. If CUSMA survives with the exemption intact and sectoral tariffs stabilize, Canada's economy absorbs the damage and recovers. If the exemption is stripped, the scarring is permanent. His baseline forecast for 2026, renegotiation that leaves lower but ongoing tariffs on steel, aluminum, and agriculture. Not a clean win for either side. A managed stalemate with embedded costs. His note on the Trump administration. It appears to be wising up to the pain tariffs are inflicting on U.S. industry. Wising up is not the same as backing down, but it signals that the negotiating window may be moving. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne, speaking from the Citadel in Quebec City, offered the clearest statement of Canada's strategic posture from inside the government. We will continue to see what we can do, but I think Canadians have understood by now that diversification is key. What he is describing is not a fallback position. It is a parallel strategy. While Carney negotiates toward CUSMA renewal, his government is simultaneously building the trade infrastructure that reduces the existential weight of whatever deal does or does not emerge. The China EV deal, which Lutnick attacked as irrational, is not irrational at all when you understand it as a piece of a diversification architecture rather than a signal of alignment with Beijing. And when trade officials from opposite sides of the political spectrum in Canada agree that diversification is now structural policy rather than contingency planning, you pay attention. To be fair to the American position, there are legitimate elements worth engaging honestly. The U.S. claim that Chinese goods are being routed through Canada and Mexico to circumvent Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs is not invented. The December 2025 USTR hearing heard substantial testimony from U.S. manufacturers documenting the transshipment problem. Steel from Chinese mills is being minimally processed in Canada and exported into the U.S. under CUSMA preferential terms, undercutting domestic American producers who face the full tariff burden on their own raw material costs. That is a real problem. It is also a problem that Canadian industry shares an interest in solving, because it is Chinese overcapacity that is driving global steel price depression.